Hello, this will be the first video going into chapter 3 of the textbook. We're going to be looking at some applications of the competitive model, specifically for evaluating interventions on the market, such as price controls, taxes, subsidies, and quotas. In order to complete that evaluation, we need concepts such as consumer and producer surplus that allow us to measure the impact of an intervention to a greater degree, and identify those welfare impacts that consumers and producers might experience. So consumer and producer surplus is often used in this way to analyze the impact of policies on markets. We use them to measure the benefits of exchange that market participants receive. And it provides the foundation of welfare economics. So if you ever or are already familiar with Pagoo, he really began welfare economics and solidified the use of consumer and producer surplus in this way. So first, let's look at consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is the difference between the price consumers would be willing to pay for a good, and this is shown by the height of their demand curve, and the price they actually have to pay. So if we look at the market for apples included on this slide, we see that at $5.50, no consumer is willing to pay for an apple, right? They get a lot of consumer surplus, $1, $2, between $5.50 and $3.50, which is the market price, but that's just too expensive for them. So no apples are bought, they get no gains. If we move to the first apple sold, bought in this case by person A, they're willing to pay $5 for that apple, but they only have to pay $3.50. So what that means is they get $1.50 of surplus, meaning that they have a benefit because they've not only gotten the good that they want, but they've gotten it at a price below what they value it at. Similarly, person B is able to purchase an apple at a lower price than what they value it at. They value it at $4.50, and they only have to pay $3.50, so they get $1 worth of surplus. Person C similarly values an apple at $4. They only pay $3.50, so they get 50 cents in surplus. And then person D values apples exactly at $3.50. They purchase at $3.50, they get no surplus, but they still have the apple that they value. So if we were to add up all of these benefits beyond receiving the good, the apple, we would get this consumer surplus present in this market. When we do this exercise, we always measure consumer surplus in dollars or whatever currency prices are listed in. Consumer surplus constitutes the area below the demand curve, right? So the demand curve will form one side of that area. It'll be above the price line. So whatever price is the market price currently, that gives us the other side of the area. And then lastly, the price axis. So together, those three lines define the consumer surplus space. It forms a triangle in this case. And so you can use an area of a triangle to find the exact amount of consumer surplus present. So here's that formula for you. You have, if you remember the area of a triangle, let's see, area is equal to, the area of a triangle formula is equal to 1/2 base times height. Okay, and that's what I've broken down here for you. I've just translated that into the specific points on our graph that you'll need to identify. So consumer surplus is 1/2 times the demand choke price, which is $5.50, minus the equilibrium price, which is $3.50. That gives us our height. And then the equilibrium quantity, in this case, is 4, and the quantity at the choke price, which is always 0. So you can see I've substituted all those values on this second bullet point here, and you can do then just that easy arithmetic, easy calculation to find the total surplus available. In this case, it's $4, right? We have 1/2 times 550 minus 350 times 4 minus 0. 550 minus 350 is going to give us 2, so we can simplify 1/2 times 2. 4 minus 0 is 4. Okay, so that gives us 1/2 times 2. We can reduce that down to 1, right? 2 goes into itself once, and we're just left with 4. Okay, All right. So let's do another practice question. So we have Ryan and Sarah who are both wanting to purchase a lollipop, and the lollipop is priced at 75 cents. Ryan is willing to pay $1 for it, and Sarah's willing to pay 50 cents. So we want to know what is their combined consumer surplus. So for Ryan, we're going to subtract from his $1 willingness to pay the actual price of the lollipop, and that gives us 25 cents, right? If we turn to Sarah, she's willing to pay only 50 cents, but the lollipop is 75 cents. So here, if we solve this relationship, we're going to see, oh no, she has negative consumer surplus, right? Can a consumer get negative consumer surplus? The answer is no, right? So what this tells us is Sarah is not going to buy this lollipop. And that's because the price exceeds her willingness to pay. Okay, so the consumer surplus in this case is only going to be 25 cents, and so our answer is going to be B. All right, so that was a little bit of a trick question there. Consumer surplus is not always going to be constant, right? It's going to depend on the market price as well as the shape of the demand curve. So that's what you're seeing here. So our demand curve 1, this blue line, is much steeper than the demand curve 2, this red line, right? So this relative slope of our demand curves can give us an idea of what the price elasticity of demand is in each case. So for D1, where we have a very much steeper curve, that tells us that consumers are going to be much less responsive to changes in price, right? Even if the price increases quite a bit, they're not going to adjust their purchasing much. Whereas consumers represented by demand curve 2, the red line, if the price were to increase to the amount I notated on the graph, right, they're not purchasing anything at that point. So they're much more responsive to changes in price. And so what we're going to see in terms of consumer surplus is that the more responsive consumers are to changes in price, the smaller the consumer surplus available, right? They're not willing to essentially continue consuming, they're going to substitute to other goods. Whereas if they're not very responsive, right, even as the price changes, we're going to see the amount traded not change very much at all. And so that area of consumer surplus is going to be much larger. As you can see, the area of consumer surplus for demand curve D1, that steeper blue curve, is this area A I've just outlined, and it's much larger than area B, which represents the consumer surplus for consumers represented by demand 2, that red line. Now let's move to producer surplus. So producer surplus here is going to be the difference between the price that producers receive for the good, that'll be the market price, and their costs of producing. And that cost of producing is going to be represented by that supply curve. Remember, it's an aggregate marginal cost curve. So it's representing the marginal cost of production of each additional amount of, in this case, apples. Okay. So the difference between the market price and the marginal cost for the firm is going to give us their producer surplus. So in this case, we have at a marginal cost of $1.50, of a price at $1.50, firms aren't going to produce anything. As soon as that price increases to $2, now we have the first pound of apples being produced, and the firm is willing to purchase that, to produce that. And so if we compare the marginal cost of $2 to the price of $3.50, producers are getting here $1.50 worth of surplus. As they produce a second pound of apples, their marginal costs go up to $2.50, and their producer surplus falls to $1. Producing the third pound costs them $3, so they get 50 cents of surplus on that third pound, and their final pound, their fourth pound that they produce, costs them exactly as much as they sell it for, so producer surplus is 0. Okay. One important distinction you need to keep in mind is that producer surplus is not profit. We discussed this in chapter 8. But just as a reminder, right, profit is total revenue minus total costs, and total cost includes fixed costs, right? And we can rewrite that as profit is equal to the difference between price and average total cost times the amount sold. Whereas producer surplus is going to be the difference between price and average variable costs times the amount sold. So producer surplus excludes fixed costs, whereas profit includes fixed costs. So that's going to be our primary difference between the two values. What this means is that firms will produce when they're making a loss, but they will not produce if they are not earning producer surplus. Okay. Similar to consumer surplus, producer surplus is measured in dollars or whatever currency the price is listed in. And it constitutes the area below the market price line, above that cost curve, that marginal cost curve or supply curve, and to the right of the price axis. Okay, so in our example here, it's forming a triangle, which means that we can, again, use that area of a triangle formula to calculate producer surplus in this case. So 1/2 base times height. Our height here is going to be the difference between the equilibrium price and the supply choke price. So in this case, the equilibrium price is 350 and the supply choke price is 150. And then the base is going to be the difference between the equilibrium quantity, which here is 4, and the quantity at the choke price, which is 0. So you can see I've substituted those values into our equation, and we can go ahead and simplify. So we have producer surplus is equal to 1/2 times 350 minus 150 times 4 minus 0. 350 minus 150 gives us 2. 4 minus 0 gives us 4. So we can rewrite this as 1/2 times 2 times 4. 1/2 times 2 gives us 1. And 1 times 4 is just 4. So in this case, our producer surplus is symmetric with our consumer surplus in this market for apples. All right, let's do another practice question. So Tom and Megan are both selling yo-yos. Tom is willing to sell his for $1.75. Megan is willing to sell hers for $1.50, and the equilibrium price is $2. So we want to find the combined value of their producer surplus. To do that, we're going to subtract from that equilibrium price each of their willingness to pay. So for Tom, we'll have $2 minus $1.75, which gets him positive 25 cents of producer surplus. For Megan, we're going to do the same. We'll have 2 minus her willingness to pay, or excuse me, willingness to sell. And so that's at 150. So we have 2 minus 150. That's going to get us 50 cents. Adding those values together, we get 75 cents, and that is our answer. Similarly to consumer surplus, producer surplus is going to change with the slope of our supply curve. So I've drawn in a second supply curve for us here, one that's less steep than the original. And as you can see, just like with consumer surplus, when the supply curve is steeper, you're going to get a greater area of producer surplus than when it is flatter. Okay, and that's again just to do with producer responsiveness. So when producers are very responsive, as in supply curve 2, they're not going to be willing to sell an item as they're not going to be as willing to sell as many, in this case apples, as the price changes. Whereas when the supply curve is steeper, they're going to be less responsive to that price and be selling more for longer as a price falls, for example. Like I mentioned before, we're going to use these concepts of consumer and producer surplus to analyze impacts of different interventions on the market. And so we can see an example of what that impact might look like. So in this case, we have a increase in manufacturing costs causing a decrease in supply. It's shifting back up into the left. And what we see is that some consumer surplus has been lost and some producer surplus has been lost, right? Originally, consumer surplus was this top triangle that I'm outlining here, the area below the demand curve and above that P1 line. And producer surplus was the bottom triangle that I've just outlined above the supply curve and below that price 1 line. Now, as supply shifts, consumer surplus falls to area A. So we've lost areas C, D, and B from consumer surplus. This B has been transferred to producers, and producers have lost just areas F and G. Okay, so with that change in supply, we've had an increase in the price, which has transferred some consumer surplus to producers. This slide just summarizes what you saw on the previous graph. We can look as well at an increase in supply, right? So if we have our supply curve shift down and to the right, what that's going to do is put downward pressure on the price, and it's going to cause consumer surplus to go from a small triangle to a much larger one. And producer surplus is likewise going to increase. You can't see it as clearly on this graph given how I've changed it. I've drawn it, but because the price is going down while quantity is going up, we're actually going to see producer surplus increase overall. When demand changes, let's say we have a decrease in demand, what we're going to see is a fall in the price and a fall in how much of this good is traded. And so what that's going to translate to for consumers is a reduction in their surplus, right? They're able to buy less. And similarly, for producers, they're not only earning less on each unit, they're selling less as well. So producer surplus also goes down. Okay. And then if we have an increase in demand, right, in that case, we're going to see an increase in price and an increase in quantity traded, and that's going to increase both producer surplus as well as consumer surplus. We'll go ahead and stop there, and in the next video, pick up with price regulations, and we'll look at price ceilings and price floors.